Good morning. Thank you all for being here. My name is Rachel Marshall. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution here at John Jay College. The IIP is a national center that brings together prosecutors, policy experts, and the communities they serve to promote data-driven criminal justice reform strategies that foster community-centered standards of safety, fairness, and dignity. This morning's session will discuss how just communities ensure that all residents are protected from violence, including gender-based violence. Our experts will discuss the drivers of gender-based and intimate partner violence, as well as evidence-based and promising approaches to disrupting these forms of violence. It is my honor to introduce our moderator, Dr. Bea Hanson, Senior Advisor in the NYC Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence, where she's responsible for developing and implementing new cutting-edge programs and policies, both inside government systems and in communities, to prevent, reduce, and respond to gender-based violence. Prior to this role, Dr. Hanson served as Chief Program Officer for Safe Horizon, a crime victim service organization, and as the Director of Client Services at the New York City Anti-Violence Project. Dr. Hanson earned a Doctor of Philosophy in Social Welfare from the City University of New York, a Master's of Social Work degree from Hunter College School of Social Work in New York, and a Bachelor's of Art degree from the University of Michigan. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hanson.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks all for being here. It's great to include gender-based violence in a conversation about criminal justice reform. I think we often get excluded from those conversations, and maybe we exclude ourselves. I'm not sure, but it's really great to be here. I also worked with Carol Mason. I headed up the Office on Violence Against Women in the Obama administration, and before coming back to New York, and happy to be here with some old and new colleagues. So I won't go through all of their bios. They're in the information that you received, but Bernadine is a research fellow at Columbia University, Bernadine Waller, and has done incredible work around community-based violence and focusing on Black women and here in New York, so really excited to hear what she's got to say. Michelle Kaminsky, who is the chief of the Gender-Based Violence Division at the Kings County District Attorney's Office, has done amazing work in terms of really lifting up the work of gender-based violence within the prosecutor's office and working closely with a lot of service providers in the city. And Juan Carlos Arian, who is from the Futures Without Violence, has done long history of working with abusive partners and working within the domestic violence field for a long time. So we're super excited to have you all. I wanted we're going to have this be more conversational, and we want to have time at the end for questions for folks as well. But I just wanted to set the scene a little bit. You know, I've been working in this field for a really long time, and it's interesting to me that you know how common gender-based violence is and how much we don't really talk about it. We don't talk about prevention. We don't talk about interventions, except for I think those of us that are doing this work, and I know many people here are doing this work as well. But you know, it affects more than 40% of women and 25% of men. So it's not like it's a little problem. It's a massive problem. So I think, you know, one of the things I'm struggling with now is like, how do we talk about it? How do we get people to talk about it? How do we talk about it ourselves? And over the last 30 years, the focus of gender-based violence has really been on systems approaches and systems responses. So this idea of like, how do we make laws? Because laws in all states around gender-based violence, how do we improve the criminal justice response, creating domestic violence and sexual violence units in police departments and prosecutors' offices and integrated domestic violence courts, the expansion of domestic violence shelters, making sure that sexual assault forensic exams are trauma focused in hospitals. And then how do we increase service provision, both more consolidated kind of work that happens in family justice centers. We have 5 of them here in New York City that my office oversees, which is co-located places to address gender-based violence, but then also community-based programs and culturally specific programs. So, you know, so there's been a lot of kind of movement. And I think when you look at the statistics, that it's really been critical in reducing violence. So we've seen huge reductions in domestic violence homicides, especially among men being killed, actually, which is interesting, and huge reductions in gender-based violence. The issue is that reduction really stopped in the early 2000s. So for the past almost 20 years now, we've seen a real plateau, and there's been no real substantial change or reduction in gender-based violence. We've seen some increase. I think COVID, we're still kind of teasing that out. There was some meta study that was done that said there was an 8% increase. I think in New York City, we haven't really seen an overall increase if you compare it over a longer period of time. But what we see is that, this plateau, like for example, here in New York City, we're not seeing any decreases in gender-based violence homicide. We're at the point now where 40% of felony assaults in New York City are related to domestic violence. So it's a huge, huge problem. And then you look at like where the resources are allocated. So we've invested in these kind of system approaches, and we're really at a point where we need to think about how do we do this differently if we're really going to reduce domestic violence and gender-based violence in general. We've been using this cookie-cutter approach that requires law enforcement response, which can ruin families and ruin individuals and ruin communities. A shelter response that is helpful for some people, but for other people, it's pulling them out of the communities where they have the support and the trust that they need. That sexual assault forensic exams oftentimes don't result in any kind of prosecution, but it's a totally invasive process for survivors. So I think the conversation we want to have now is how do we think about the impact of some of these choices that we've made, and how do we think about things differently? And there's a lot of people that have been thinking about this for a long time. Actually, we're very opposed to the way the whole Violence Against Women Act was created in the first place, because it was very focused on criminal justice systems. But the recent focus, I think, around the impact of the pandemic and around racial justice reform has really provided, I think, an opportunity for a broader group of people to really be discussing this. And so we're excited to be part of the conversation, the broader conversation here, and to have this with you. So I'm going to throw out a few questions for the panelists, and then we want to have some opportunity for you all to dialogue too. So I'm going to start about, and maybe I think Bernadine, maybe you can be the start on this. Is to think about, from the work that you've been doing, what do you see as some of the root causes and some of the kind of underlying determinants around gender-based violence and impact on folks?
Thank you so much for that question, Bea. I think, again, to center my work, I think if we're focusing on the most underserved women who are experiencing gender-based violence, if we can look to target our services, our supports, and resources on those women, then we can elevate every woman. And so that really does hone in on my work. My work really does center around Black women who are experiencing intimate partner violence victimization. The reason why I chose that is because they don't have the highest prevalence rates. The highest prevalence rates really do rest among Native American women. However, they have the poorest outcomes. They're more likely to be murdered than women of any other racial ethnic background. And that's very telling. And so the reason why I bring that up is because there are definitely a lot of structural drivers to that. I want you to think of things, macro systems like the educational system, right? And so before I decided to hone in on Black women, I did some studying on Black male batterers. And what I found is the batterer intervention system is misaligned with how Black people's ways of knowing and being. And what we also found in a systematic review is that the dropout rates among Black male batterers mirrored the murder rates among Black women. So if we can fix the batterer intervention program and make sure it's culturally salient, sorry about that, my alarm for a reminder. If we can work to fix that, and in that review, what we found is education. Black men and Black women are traditionally undereducated, and or resources are not pumped into those neighborhoods to really make sure that they're getting the quality of education that they deserve. Another driver that we have, not only with the educational system, is also financial and economic resources and mobility. How are we designing our communities so that they are equitable? We're not, right? I am a native of Long Island, and Long Island has what is known as sunset towns. And sunset towns basically are, at sunset, if you're Black or brown, you're leaving that predominantly white neighborhood, right? So I want you to think of towns like Garden City. A lot of folks from the boroughs come to the Roosevelt Field Mall. That's a sunset town. So when that sun sets, everybody who's deposited their money into Roosevelt Field Mall, guess what? Everybody's going home. And who's getting the benefit of that money? The white, wealthy children. Macy's in Garden City, right before the pandemic. Macy's of Garden City was collecting money for the students of Garden City. Right across the street from Garden City is Hempstead. Hempstead is one of the poor neighborhoods on Long Island. It is also Black and brown people predominantly reside in that neighborhood. They weren't collecting money for Hempstead. They weren't collecting money for Roosevelt. They were collecting money for Garden City. That is already over-resourced. And so I think if we can look to be very strategic and purposeful and intentional in a lot of the ways that we are planning our towns and our cities, and of course, I just brought out Long Island. Trust me, I know that that happens right here in the boroughs, right? Part of what I do, my research is really community engaged. And I talk with, of course, I'm not dressed like this when I'm talking with the survivors, right? I'm coming in with jeans and sneakers because they need to know that I'm one of them, that I get you, right? Thank you for the snaps. I hear you, I hear you, I hear you. You need to know that I'm one of you and that I get you and that I'm doing this work because I'm invested. And I am invested because I had a girlfriend in high school who was murdered by her intimate partner. I had another girlfriend whose sister was murdered by her intimate partner. And so this is not just me trying to, oh, Bernadine wants to do some good deeds. No, this is Dr. B who's decided that I'm on a mission. And if there's gonna be a change, if I'm gonna be the force that I need to be in order to make sure I am reflecting and working and partnering with Dr. Hanson and Michelle, right? And talking with them and telling them, I've talked to these women, and here are the brokens in your system, and this is what needs to be fixed. And so if we're looking at these structural drivers and indicators, if we can help the most underserved communities, then we're gonna lift everyone's community.
Thank you, Bernadine. Thank you. Because I think Bernadine talked about abusive partners, so I'm going to go to Juan Carlos to talk a little bit about from your perspective in your work, where you've seen some of the drivers and what's behind a lot of the violence.
Yeah, in some way that's the $64 billion question, right? Because it's like, oh, if it was one thing, maybe we would have solved the problem by now. Obviously, it's extremely complex. And I think part of the problem is that we have different pockets of people doing work that say, oh, this is the driver. Oh, that is the driver. But it's really the combination of things, in my opinion. For me, more than 30 years working with abusive partners, it's obvious that a central driver is how we socialize boys. Sexism, patriarchy, whatever you want to call it, you know? when we tell boys that they can resolve things through violence, and that they shouldn't have any feelings and they shouldn't be vulnerable, that has an effect, not only in gender-based violence, but in violence in general. And that's one thing that I did want to talk about, is that we need to start breaking these silos. It's wonderful that we have this panel in this conference, but I think this should be central to the conference, because even though we define gender-based violence by survivors, as it should be, right? Like primarily people who identify as women and LGBTQ and folks of other genders. If we go into perpetrators of violence, and I'm not only talking gender-based violence, of all violence, are by and large people who identify and have been socialized as males, right? So what's up with that? Why is that happening? We need to be asking those questions. And then, in addition to that socialization, and let's face it, the air that we all breathe, patriarchy and sexism and racism and homophobia and all of that, then you have those other drivers that you were mentioning, education, poverty, which sometimes in our fields have been discarded in some way. You know, well, it's true it happens, you know, to people of all socioeconomic status, but the impact is different, right? We need to have those open conversations. And when I'm not surprised about what you were saying about your research, and I will look it up for sure after this. But in particular, the field, the so-called battering or batterers intervention, or abusive partner intervention, as it's called in New York now, has traditionally been totally ignored culture. Absolutely. It has only focused on gender, which it has to, right? But still, you know, if you think about it, the most common model used across the U.S. is the Duluth model. Yes. Have you ever been to Duluth? There's not a lot of people of color there. There's indigenous people there. You know, and not to reduce the importance of that work, but we need to. I think even now, I think it's been almost 50 years since the first program started in the 70s. Even now, I could count with one hand, maybe one and a half hands, how many programs take into consideration other aspects of culture, race, sexual orientation. Generally, those things don't exist. And I have to say that's one of the frustrations of my career, because I have seen movement in other aspects of things, but this one is harder. And I know the domestic violence field, by and large, has started to reckon with issues of race since George Floyd and other murders. But for batterers intervention, I don't see a lot of that. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen.
Thanks, Juan Carlos. Michelle, do you want to talk a little bit about from where you sit as a prosecutor doing this work?
Yes.
You have a you should have you.
Mic options. Is it on?
Yep.
Oh, okay. All right. I agree with what Juan Carlos and Bernadine have said. I'm looking at it through the lens of the criminal justice system, what I see, and you know, a lot of research shows, depending who's doing the research as to the root causes of domestic violence, there's, you know, one theory that it's the patriarchy, another that it's structural conditions like racism and poverty, another theory is it's individual psychopathology, and I've seen it all from my position in, before I was chief of the Gender-Based Violence Division. I was running the Domestic Violence Bureau for 8 years, and before that I was a domestic violence prosecutor for 17 years. And I've seen all of that. So, which even complicates it more, because how do you address with all these, there's so many layers to it. And then when it comes to the drivers of crime, which is really a term of art used as a lot of criminologists are looking at who are the drivers of crime, and then in applying it in the context of gender-based violence, I think it's really difficult, because I can't tell you there's any one type of driver doing this. We get about 10,000 cases a year just in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office for domestic violence, and we also know that it is a underreported crime. So to actually say to look at the drivers of crime really comes from data that is gathered to see like who's driving shootings, homicides, gang activity, and to borrow that concept and apply it, especially in domestic violence, which makes up, in any of the city prosecutor's offices here in the 5 boroughs, domestic violence is probably a third of the caseload in the court system. And again, I can't say that we could draw any conclusions from the data as to what one individual person looks like who's doing, committing these acts.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's just this, it's a complicated way of looking at things, and how do we, and how the focus of this on a criminal justice intervention ignores the kind of complexity in some ways of what gender-based violence is, and using that lens is limiting, and I think that's what we're all kind of been talking about, and I think the movement has really been struggling with. Well, let's talk a little bit about what we've seen in terms of some success stories, or kind of like, or directions that we need to go in to address some of these issues. So I don't know, Bernadine, do you want to take that again in terms of the research that you've been doing?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Hanson. And so,
You just call me Bea.
listen, from one doc to another doc, I get it. Always want to give respect, because we work hard for those letters, honey. We work real hard for those letters. Especially working full-time and working for those letters. Sis, I get it. But B, as you've asked me to call you, now, see, I messed around and forgot the question.
So it's really like, what are some kind of like either successful strategies you've seen to address some of this that are kind of a new area, or sort of some of the gaps in direction that we need to move in?
I think what we need to do is we need to be in the community. How can we say we're serving and servicing a community that we are not immersed in? We need to have boots on the ground. We need to be there. They need to see us before they see there's a problem. They need to see us as partners with them to help develop solutions. I'll give you an example, right? Because I come with the research lens. And so 2 months ago, I started a study that was actually supposed to end for funding purposes. Things got held up. But in 3.5 weeks, I collected data, qualitative data, from 30 participants in 3.5 weeks. For those researchers who are here in this room, you will tell me that that is unprecedented, and that never, when I tell you never, it never happens. Most of my sample was a snowball sample, because what happened was I had survivors who told other survivors, talk to Dr. B, because guess what? She's real, she's keeping it 100, she's one of us, and she wants to center our voices in what she's doing. And when the survivors found out that that's what I was doing, I had no problems reaching my end, right? Because what my goal is, and B's like, Bern, what are you working on? What are you working on, right? I'll let the cat out the bag, right? And so what I am working on now is developing an evidence-based intervention for Black women survivors of intimate partner violence by Black women survivors of intimate partner violence. And the reason why I'm doing that is because no one has done that. How is it we have a field that has been working for more than 30, 50 years in this work, and no one has bothered to go to the women who are most likely murdered? Now, New York City, by and large, has not seen an increase, but during the pandemic, in Queens, they saw a 2-fold increase in the homicide rates among Black women. That is a problem. Numbers are not just numbers to me, right? Numbers are people, and the people who are connected to those people. And so I want to know, why are we not doing this? What is broken? Another study that I just did, and shared it with your colleagues in Brooklyn in the Vitality Review Committee, was I wanted to find out, where are the gaps in our service provision? What's broken? And when I tell you, I had a long list of things in the criminal justice system, and I'll share that with you offline, right? She's like, please don't expose me, Bernadine. I promise I won't do that, right? I had a long list of brokens and things that need to be fixed. And I will just give one broad-based one, is we have coordinated care within our service, our family justice system, our family justice centers, which are in each borough, but our coordination is not necessarily integration. There's a difference. And the biggest issue, and I brought this up to Commissioner Sewell when I saw her a couple of months ago, the family court system isn't talking to the criminal court system. So that when someone has an order of protection in the criminal court system against their perpetrator, guess what? The family court system knows nothing about it. So I am now waiting for the family court with my perpetrator, who has an order of protection against me and is now taking that opportunity to harass me before the courts. That is a problem. And so I think if we can make sure we are truly investing our time, our energy, our resources within these communities that are saying, you know what, I called the police and it took a whole hour and I live 2 blocks away from the precinct. That's a problem, right? And these aren't things that we don't know happen, which is why I have no problems with saying it publicly. I'll tell you the other stuff, I promise, off to the side, right? But if we can really invest in these communities, invest in the communities that people seem to have forgotten, and center their voices, ask them what the problems are. They know what the problems are. They're experiencing the problems. And if they know that, they will help you find solutions, because the question and the knowledge and the solutions always rest with the people. They don't rest with people like myself. What I do is I work with partners who are invested in looking for these solutions. I get the funding, and we try and make some changes and shifts. So it's all about community, B.
Yeah, no, community and the collaboration, both of those things, yeah, for sure. Thank you, Bernadine. Do you want to talk, Michelle, a little bit about how you see some of the successful strategies and some of those gaps as well?
Yes. So again, I'm talking from the lens of the work that I do. I started in the district attorney's office in 1992, and I just, in terms of success, where we came from and where we're at now, I tell everyone that back in 1992, pre-Violence Against Women Act, pre-mandatory arrest in New York, the Domestic Violence Bureau was in a rundown room in the courthouse. No one wanted to go to the bureau. Everyone saw it as you were being punished if you got sent to do domestic violence work. No one really wanted to do the work. And now where we are today, we have domestic violence units in every single police precinct in the city. We have specialized domestic violence court parts in criminal court and in Supreme Court. The Domestic Violence Bureau is the largest bureau in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. It's the most resourced. So we've come a long way in terms of how I think as a society we just look at domestic violence, that it's been elevated. And yet, we know that there are still so many limitations, like what Bernadine was saying. We are one system, and then the family court is another system that deals with domestic violence. The Administration for Children's Services is another system, and these systems are siloed and they don't speak with each other. And we have, understanding that, we try to do on an individual basis, coming together on cases and troubleshooting with the different systems. But it really, we need a much larger systemic approach to be able to do that. And at the same time, I will say, understanding, that so much money went into the criminal justice system through the Violence Against Women Act. We were the recipient of millions and millions of dollars to build up our domestic violence bureau and the services that we provide. Understanding that power that we have, we are also in Brooklyn looking to scale back the work that we have done for so long. We were under the belief that, especially women, because the majority of the cases we are seeing is female victimization and male offenders, that even if someone would say, you know what, I don't want to go forward with the criminal prosecution, for so long we were under just one view, well, this is all about witness intimidation. And witness intimidation does take place, but it was really that would be the only reason someone wouldn't want to go forward with criminal prosecution. So we need, as the government, the district attorney's office, we have to step in and we have to hold this offender accountable. And then when you start to talk about, well, what does accountability really look like in the criminal justice system for the vast majority of these cases? Because we only have about 250 felony indictments out of 10,000 cases that are coming in. So those felony indictments being the most serious, attempted murder, shootings, serious assaults, versus the 9,000 other cases that are being handled in the criminal court. Accountability is really, no one goes to jail for domestic violence crimes. It's just domestic violence and gender-based violence are not driving the prison numbers, I could tell you that. So we have decided in Brooklyn that, if someone is saying that they don't want to go forward on a charge for on misdemeanor charges that make up the bulk of the cases, we're not doing it. We make referrals to other services that exist in the Family Justice Center, community-based organizations, but we're not pushing something anymore, which for so long had been going on under this belief that we know better, and as prosecutors we know better, so we are not doing that. But I would say that the big gap in the system is that our work is reactive work as prosecutors, that why it gets back to the original question, why does gender-based violence exist? What are we doing to stop it? That's not where the efforts are going. It is still really focused on reactive measures, and we're trying to do more work in the community to bring, not necessarily that it's the district attorney's office doing the work, but bringing our contacts and the power of the district attorney's office to kind of push things that are going on in the community to support them to do more work. And I think on the next round of question, I'll talk about that.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Juan Carlos, from kind of your perspective, what do you see as some successful strategies and some of the
So
gaps?
first, I want to build upon this idea that if we only have one solution to domestic violence, we're probably doing something wrong, right? And we talk about being survivor-centered, and sometimes I guess the question to ask is which survivors, right? Which voices of survivors, as you were saying before. Some survivors, it's not that we're not survivor-centered, but we're not inclusive of all voices. And I think traditionally, we have silenced some voices of survivors. She's not ready to leave, she's in denial, we only have one solution. So at Futures, we talk about pathways to accountability, however you want to define it, because that's another thing that, what do we mean by accountability? I like to think about accountability, and this is partly a transformative justice approach, as both consequences, not necessarily legal consequences, but consequences and limits, plus support for change. That has to be part of accountability. Otherwise, you know, even if someone went to jail, I mean, we use that, right? Like, oh, he was held accountable because he went to jail. He wasn't held accountable, he went to jail, which maybe he needed to, but accountability involves also taking responsibility, right? And changing, basically. So, having said that, going to your question, we need different pathways to this accountability. Battery intervention programs, again, they have been around for 50 years. Maybe they contributed to those changes in statistics. I'm not sure, right? As you know, the research is quite mixed about that. But I have seen, as a practitioner, that it works with some people. But mainly people that have a large stake of conformity in the issue, right? Meaning a lot to lose in some way. And then there's so many variables, and then you don't know if it was the program itself. But having said that, I do think that people, and I shouldn't say are starting to, because I think people have been doing work under the radar, partly because our movement has been very afraid of any kind of intervention that doesn't look like mainstream interventions. But you well-known restorative justice or practices, more and more people are talking about that. And when we say that, I just always want to clarify, we don't mean putting a survivor and a person who causes harm in the same room necessarily, unless the survivor wants that, right? Restorative justice, well done, is more survivor-centered than anything else that we do, certainly than criminal responses in general, right? It's driven by survivors. Transformative justice, which is totally outside of systems. Community accountability, some interesting stuff. Mimi Kim and Sujata Baliga in California are doing some really interesting things about that. I think there's other potentials. You know, battery intervention programs have so many problems in some ways, but responsible fatherhood programs, or programs that are a hybrid between responsible fatherhood and domestic violence. There's some interesting programs. One is Strong Fathers in North Carolina that are doing that work with good results. Caring Dads out of Canada it's another possibility. But the other one that I have been very intrigued by is helplines for people who cause harm. And with the pandemic, the first helpline in the US was started in Western Massachusetts. And I had to ask the question after, like, why didn't we think about this before? I mean, the UK, Australia, Colombia, Sweden, Israel, they have these helplines and receive thousands of calls from people who cause harm, asking for help, okay? And I believe that partly is that we have had a paradigm in this country that people who cause harm will not do that, will not ask for help, or will not want to change, or will not come to programs, quote unquote, voluntarily, that we need a mandate for that. And we have seen in other countries, but now we're seeing in places like, I mean, there's so much going on in New York, and Bea has been responsible for a lot of that innovation, so I did want to mention that to you. I'm very grateful for that. But there's been programs, right now I'm doing a small study on strategies to engaging people who cause harm outside the criminal justice system and child welfare, and I'm interviewing various providers and people who cause harm and their partners about it. And it's interesting, faith-based programs. And Dr. Oliver Williams, which is a good friend, has been doing amazing work, mainly in the South, with ministers. There's a faith-based program in Chicago that is Spanish-speaking.
Yes.
And you know about
Yes.
Maxine Davis research? Yes.
Good friend of mine.
And, oh, excellent. So all voluntary, right? Voluntary. And I don't like to use voluntary because I understand nobody wakes up in the morning, it's like, I'm going to battery intervention, right? Usually it's another driver, like, you know, an ultimatum, children, and so on. But that's a wonderful example. And there's a couple in the West Coast, in Seattle, and in
And one in New
Portland.
York, too. Yeah, that our office operates.
The faith-based
Yeah.
one?
Well, it's not, not faith-based, but a
Oh,
voluntarily
the voluntary
one.
one,
Yeah,
yes, yes.
yeah,
I was
called
talking
respect and
of the
responsibility.
faith-based, yeah. So that's, yeah, I think that's, and again, I'm not someone that says either or. I think we have to have all those pathways. We need a criminal legal system. We need a child welfare system, but we need reform on those systems, and we also need these other pathways, including more helplines for folks who use violence. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to do a little time check. I don't know, Rachel, do you have a time check about how, I want to make sure we have time for questions.
Yeah, we have about 20 minutes left.
20 minutes left. Okay, so I think we'll spend a few minutes, each of us, just talking a little bit about sort of what do we see the next steps as being. I'm going to start with Michelle, because you kind of started that a little bit.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about some programming that we have going on in one area in Brooklyn and Brownsville, some promising stuff. One, and it doesn't involve the work of the district attorney's office, but we know about it and we support it. There is work around circles going on where it's not having a survivor in the group, but young men who are committing community violence. We started to see that there are big links between those committing community violence and those committing domestic violence. So there's circles going on with young men who are involved in gangs and gun violence. And in the circles, they're not only talking about that aspect of the gangs and the guns, but about their childhoods and growing up in homes where domestic violence was committed. And it's very powerful. And their childhoods, and then growing up and finding support on the streets, in the gangs, getting into relationships, committing domestic violence. So we're seeing the money ran out for this one program, and the leader of it is self-funding it because some of the men were pretty hysterical when it was coming to an end. They rely on it. They like to go weekly. They found support. They're doing a lot of work around de-escalation, and it sounds something very promising. It always becomes, and there's a facilitator for it, but how do you bring something like this to scale? And then another thing going on is in Brownsville, about every other month, they have something called the Brownsville Safety Alliance, where public safety is turned over to the community and the police retreat from a particular area. They're in agreement that violence interrupters are responsible for public safety issues, and the police will not handle anything going on in that area. And this started at the end of December of 2020, and the Safety Alliance has met a few times, but there's some promising results going on there where whatever they see going on in this particular catchment area, it is the violence interrupters that are responsible for handling it, so the police aren't coming in. And there have been incidents of domestic violence. I'll give you one example of what happened. It involved a young woman who was 8 months pregnant. She's out in front of a store with a man. She's very upset, and she starts punching him. Now, if the police were there, you could easily see that the police could go there, and they could end up arresting the woman who's 8 months pregnant. The violence interrupter group, known as BEVO, Brownsville In, Violence Out, goes up and approaches, and the woman's really upset, and she said, my boyfriend promised that he was gonna pick up a car seat for the baby, because I'm about to give birth any day now, and install it in the car, and he hasn't done it. They removed the two of them. They brought her over as part of this Safety Alliance. All community resources that exist in the community are out tabling. They brought her over to a table that deals with maternal health care, and they were able to get her a car seat and have it installed that day. And they handled a situation that could have easily escalated with the police being the ones responding to something like this. So these are just some promising things going on in one particular local community.
Great. And I know in the city, too, we've also embedded domestic violence advocates within a number of the violence interrupter programs around the city as well. Yeah. Bernadine, do you want to talk a little bit about some promising thoughts?
I'm just so blown away by the violence interrupters because there is research to show that there's a connection between community violence and gender-based violence. In fact, if we go back to the mass shooting in Connecticut 10, 12 years ago, that started off as a family violence incident, and it ended up with dozens of children and teachers getting murdered because a family violence or gender-based violence incident spiraled out of control. There is a huge correlation, significant correlation, between family violence and community violence and mass shootings in particular. So I am glad that we are talking about this in this setting, because if we don't deal with what's going on in our families, then we really are not dealing with what's going on in our communities, because multiple families are what create community. That said, what I see as next frontier is really engaging faith-based organizations, which is something that I'm starting to do in my work. And the reason being is because historically, again, if you're looking at Black and brown communities, they're the most religious populations in the United States, right? The Black church has been known to mobilize voting. It's been known to mobilize public health. It's been known to mobilize cancer screenings, breast cancer, colorectal cancer. So why can it not be a place where people can go for survivors for intimate partner violence? Why is it not a place where we are providing and delivering mental health care? Some Black churches have counseling services and supports, right? Some iglesias have counseling services and supports. At Columbia, that's something that we're doing. The entire collective of our society has suffered significant mental health outcomes, poor outcomes, as a result of the pandemic. People are more depressed than ever. Depression rates have gone up, threefold increase. Rates of anxiety have gone up 2 to 3 times. And so what are we doing? We are engaging with our religious partners and teaching lay health providers how to deliver brief evidence-based interventions so that they can stay in their communities and don't feel like they have to go to a hospital or to a clinic that, again, was not developed or designed to fully service them and are not necessarily culturally salient. And so if we're going to make sure we are fully designing and developing and integrating systems of support, it's got to be with community, by community, for community.
Thank you, Bernadine. Would you like to add?
I just say
About 10
amen
more
to
minutes,
that,
I
my
think.
gosh.
Yeah.
Both of you, it's amazing the work that is happening, and very, very hopeful that things are changing. So I second everything that has been said. Two things I would add. One is we need more emphasis on prevention, right? And going to schools, I know some people do that, and as early as almost kindergarten, one of the other silo interventions is the field of bullying, which often doesn't take gender into consideration. But I know that as young as first, second, third grade, it's sexual harassment, basically. We don't call it that, but because it doesn't seem appropriate, but it's gender-based bullying, you could call it, as early as first grade, right? So we need to have that analysis and look at that. The other thing, and you have really taken the lead in New York, is we need funding for these kinds, for intervention for people who cause harm. BIP, sure, but other interventions that we have been talking about as a society, as a country, we have not really done that. We haven't taken that seriously. The hotline is, or the helpline is a good example. It's ongoing conversations with the federal government about funding, and as you know, there's millions and millions of dollars who go to the victims hotline, which is fine. I mean, we don't want that money to be reduced, but we need other streams of funding for doing work with people who cause harm and to really create change. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to lift up a couple of things in New York. I would be remiss to not talk about the Office of the Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence. And we've done a lot of work around abusive partner programs or programs for people who cause harm outside of the criminal justice system. We have a new program called Respect and Responsibility with a number of community organizations that we're operating. We have a new program that's going to start, which is for teens who are causing harm in relationships. And we worked a lot with the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice on an abusive partner program that's culturally relevant and trauma-focused, and that is free because it's always cost money. So those are a couple of things in addition to some micro-grant programs that we've had for survivors. But I wanted to open it up to folks if there are any questions. Right in the front. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for doing this. I'm Dara Baldwin. I do disability justice, and I just want to say thank you. And what you were talking about, Dr. B, is those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, right? We have that saying in the community. And then also being anti-racist. So I do disability justice, which centers Black disabled people, right? So you can be anti-racist is one part. The second part is being pro-Black and letting Black people lead, and we need to know this. But my question to you all, and I love all of these solutions, and sorry for those of you who were in the room yesterday, but no one's following the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. All the programs you talk about, and I've been doing this work since 2009. I helped write the disability language and reauthorization of VAWA in 2012, and then last year, right? And these programs are not doing that. Faith-based programs, so you know many people don't know this, are exempt from the ADA, right? The religious groups are exempt from the ADA. So they don't have to follow the ADA, and they will tell us that. Great voting rights programs, right? But where do people go to vote? Churches, what are they not? Accessible, right? That's why we don't have accessible voting in this. So I just want people to understand and know this, and I really want to know how you can include disabled activists in this work. And most people who come in contact with this violence become a person with a disability. And Ross Baraka, I grew up in Brick City, Newark, New Jersey, he said it. We call it perpetual PTSD, right? It's perpetual trauma. It is not post, right, traumatic trauma. It is continuous. And so you have it for the rest of your life. And I will say this to everybody. After COVID, we all have a disability. Let's be real here. But I just want to hear how you can include disability in this work. And even as the violent prevention people, there are disabled men who want to help out, and they tell them no because of their disability. And that is not right in this work. And they act like people with disability are asexual, like they don't have these relationships. And that is not right. So I was just wondering how you can include that, or if we can talk about including our community.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I know that in a lot of, like there was a federal microgrant program that an organization did, and they found that like the largest population of people that they were serving were actually people with disabilities and people of color with disabilities, and that had not even been in their kind of mindset to think about. So I appreciate you bringing it up. Is there anything anyone wants to say specifically? Because I think.
And you can add them as your indicators
Yeah.
in your research. We're not even in there as indicators
Yeah.
in research.
Good point. Yeah.
That's an awesome point. Thank you so much for bringing that to my attention as a researcher, because you're right. We don't always center, and I said, if we can work and center the voices of those who are most marginalized, right? So if I want to look at, the overlapping intersecting multi-axis points of marginalization and truly look at that, I'm going to look at someone who is Black or brown, who is a part of the LGBTQ community. I'm tongue-tied, right? LGBTQ community, who is also has a disability, right? So if I can center that in the research that I'm developing, then I'm going to help everyone. So thank you so much for that.
And you just
Thank-
said what disability justice is.
Yeah.
That's what we tell people. We call it multi-marginalization.
Yep.
Right?
Thank you for that.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. In the back over there? We should get a mic on, because I think they're recording it, so you should have a mic. And also, so people can really hear.
Sure. Hi. So one of the things you were talking about was siloed communications between all these different departments. Until most recently, I worked at Chicago's Mayor's Office of Public Safety, working very closely with, I assume you know Darcy Flynn, our GBV advisor. And one of the things we were trying to do, advocates were asking us for the past 10 years to break the siloed communications between the Department of Children and Family Services in Illinois and Chicago Police Department for domestic violence calls. And I was spearheading the efforts to make this data sharing happen, and Darcy and I had a conversation on pause. And we were like, we can't do this without a racial equity lens, because we know Department of Children and Family Services in Illinois especially, which is under consent decree, is notorious for its practices, racist practices. So what is gonna happen to the children of Black and brown women when those people go and know that they have been victims of domestic violence? So we were like, we need to pause, we need to make sure this silo exists for now until we can find a solution. So I was curious about these silos. How do you deal with that? Have you dealt with that in your work? What are some solutions there? Thank you.
Juan Carlos, I know your office, your organization's been doing some work in this
Yeah,
area.
some of my colleagues have been really working, and we actually worked in Illinois, in Lake County, recently. It's an enormous problem, and I thank you for naming it as racism. People talk about disproportionality, which is such a euphemism for racism, so I'll tell you where we are right now. We need, and this might be controversial, and I know we are almost at the end of the panel, we need to radically change mandatory reporting. Mandatory reporting drives this disproportionality. And we need to find alternatives to mandatory reporting. And some people are starting to do that. I was at a conference in DC last week, actually, where they were, again, a helpline or a warm line, they call it, where mandatory reporters could call for cases that are, I mean, some cases have to be reported, but the majority of them are neglect, another euphemism for poverty, right? For survivors who don't protect their children, what's up with that, right? So we need alternative, because as you know, child welfare, and there might be some child welfare people here, I respect the work, it's so hard. But this principle that they have, when in doubt, report, is extremely problematic, extremely problematic, right? So I think that's a promising practice in child welfare too, because as you know, the majority of cases are for neglect, not for abuse, for neglect. So we need that kind of response, and of course, down the pipe, many other ways in which we put in check, race, poverty, and so on. So.
And I think New York State is doing a lot of work in this area as well. So there's other follow-up we could do. Can I get you over here, sir?
Hi, everyone. My name is Cameron Okeke. I work at the Vera Institute of Justice. I'm a senior program associate. I have a question kind of related to like the prevention aspect of it. So I used to work with young people for a very long time. They're great and wonderful, but a lot of them don't really understand or have an avenue into a healthy like relationship. So I'm from the South Side of Chicago. We're infamous for a lot of things, but a lot of the conflict when I was doing my gun violence research was around interpersonal relationships, right? And there was a big silo between the people who are like, I want to do gun violence reduction work, which normally means I want to prevent the public from seeing these, like being exposed to conflicts between young Black men age 18 to 25. And then there's other people doing like interpersonal, domestic, gender-based violence, who's like the violence happening in the home. But when I talk to my students, a lot of the conflict that they're having with each other are about their relationships. It's like, oh, so-and-so touched my girlfriend the wrong way, or looked at her the wrong way, or talked to her the wrong way. Like, it's not, there isn't actually really a silo there. And aside from the program we were running, there were no like in-school or out-of-school programs that were like, here's how to have a healthy relationship, right? A lot of the work that we do is extremely sex negative, or just like avoid hurting other people. Like, don't scream, don't yell, like, don't be abusive, as opposed to be consensual, like, be liberatory, like, have healing and vulnerable relationships with each other. And so I have seen that in churches, but as a member of the queer community, Black churches really aren't for me. And so I'm curious about where people can go to learn how to be in healthy relationship with each other. That isn't just about preventing them from hurting each other, but teaching them how to have thriving relationships.
So I'll take that one. The CDC has a curriculum called Safe Dates that is specifically designed for youth and young adults to teach them about healthy relationships. If you go on to the CDC's website and look up teen dating violence, literally it's in that the core curriculum is there, and you can get trained. I believe the training is free. And when in doubt, the email address is teendating@cdc.org.
And I think also push your communities to do some of this work. Like, so for example, in New York City, we have relationship abuse prevention programs in all the high schools across New York City. We have them in a number of middle schools, and we have a curriculum for elementary schools that we're trying to get more funding to do all of that stuff. So we can see if we can share that curriculum too.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Will it include disabled students?
Yeah.
Because a lot of
Yeah.
schools, because of IDEA.
Uh-huh.
Sorry, I just want to thank you, and that is an accessible
Yeah.
thing. Because a lot of, when you're saying the teen program, I mean, at CDC, they will not, because if you have an IEP, you're not allowed to take classes about sexuality, right? Yeah, they exclude our students. That is why children with disabilities and women, usually girls, but boys as well and others, are raped at a higher rate because they don't know anything. So if you have an IEP, you're not allowed to take those classes,
Interesting.
just so you know that.
Interesting. Thank you for that.
So if your child has an IEP, they won't get that.
Yeah, interesting.
I have to defer on that one.
Okay.
A child with an IEP, as long as it is not in an ICT class, will not be able to take that class. And I'm going to defer that on the fact of a child with an IEP, okay? If it has an IEP that is not a student that is capable of being in an ICT program will be able to take that class. But a student that is not, that will have like a more severe disability, will not be allowed to take that class. She is correct in that. So, and another question, I'm sorry. I want to know a lot of the programs that you mentioned before that are happening in New York City. I want to know if they're actually reaching the Bronx. I'm one of the parent leaders within my District 8 schools in the Bronx, and I lived 2 years of a student being battered by her partner in a school, in a high school, and no one was doing anything. So how is it that if there is schools, high schools and middle schools that are able to have these programs, that one student had to live through that without being serviced or being helped?
Yeah, because we're not in
wanna
all the
know.
schools. Yeah, especially in middle schools. Yeah, thank you for that.
Hi, these are all great questions, by the way. I'm very appreciative of all the panelists and every single person who is here. I think that gender violence, especially in the diversity of the communities that are in New York, needs to be addressed, not just the Black community or the white community. I'm pretty sure that the Asian community is a very big proponent of, especially, they have a faith-based program in approaching that domestic violence. And then there is also that stigma of LGBTQ, of not being able to be welcomed into that community. But my question is more for the justice aspect and the focus. So I've been seeing recently cases involving Brooklyn and Staten Island of domestic partner violence, but it's not just domestic partner violence. It ends up being a case of suspected human trafficking because of the nature of the relationship that happened in between. So there was a case that happened that I couldn't get out of my mind where a girl was being trafficked from Staten Island to Brooklyn. And I was wondering because there was somebody who came in from the Brooklyn DA to my class, and he said that while he was working on the case, it was an entirely new program that he was talking about, because that kind of perpetrator was known in that area for kind of getting girls or getting kind of relationships and bringing them to Brooklyn to see how they could be trafficked or anything. So I was wondering if there was any kind of initiatives on that, or if any anything is going on for Queens or any of the other boroughs. Thank you.
Yeah. I could speak to you after more for the specifics of what went on in the matter you're talking about, but I can tell you that in the Domestic Violence Bureau, often when we do an initial screen, when a case is coming in and we're speaking to a survivor, we spot trafficking cases. It could come in as a relationship crime, but then we realize that the boyfriend is really the trafficker. And so we spot cases out of domestic violence cases where it's really a case of trafficking. We have a trafficking unit in our office that's run by David Weiss. I'm wondering if that's the person who spoke in your class. So.
He said it was a new program,
But it's something common that does happen, and that's how we're able to spot them. I just wanted to say, as to the disability question, we have a victim services unit within the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, and cultural competency is something that's critical to the work that we do. We have a counselor designated who deals with the intersection of intimate partner violence and disability. So, also to know the other organizations that exist in the city, so proper referrals are made and proper support is given in those cases.
I think we can stick around if people have other questions. I know we're out of time, but really appreciate everybody's involvement and participation in this, and thanks to all the panelists and colleagues.
And thank you, Rachel.